Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance, and once again we have Rich Hammar, legal counsel to the General Counsel of the Assemblies of God. And we have a special guest with us today. Carter McDaniel is the church administrator here at Central Assembly of God, and Carter, glad to have you aboard with us today.
Well, thanks, Jerry. It's great to have you guys here at Central.
We're going to talk a little bit more about church fraud, where we talked about it last month, but kind of just do a follow-up, and it's great to have a church administrator here, so we're talking about church fraud, and this happens to be a nice, large church, and we would like to have your intake on this. So anytime we have any questions or make a comment, you have something, just jump right on in.
All right, Jerry.
So what we're going to do is talk about a little bit about the internal controls and what churches should do. We're going to do a follow-up, kind of summarize where we were at last week. And really the internal controls we set up are how a church should handle their cash and the church assets to reduce the risk of theft or mismanagement. So Rich, why don't you go through and we'll just kind of summarize some of the internal controls that we put together or talked about last month at our webinar.
Okay, let's do that. And as I go through these, I have 13 that I'm going to mention quickly. These are kind of the key components of internal control. We use the term internal control. In a technical sense, of course, it just means having proper oversight over the handling of cash as well as church assets, and to ensure accountability. And there are a number of things that can be done to ensure a competent system of internal control, which in turn will reduce greatly the risk of financial fraud. So we went over these last week. I'm going to mention them quickly again today, and you gentlemen both can comment on these. If you can think of something you can say that will amplify these points. So the first one, these are not in any order, by the way. The first one is, of course, to have more than one person count the church offering. I know what you're thinking. How could a church have one person count the offering? You know, Bob's back in that locked office every Sunday counting the offering. How is this possible? Let me tell you how it's possible. Church leaders don't want to offend people. And if we tell Bob, you know, we think there ought to be a second person counting that offering, you mean I've been doing this for 25 years by myself and now you're accusing me of wrongdoing? And so church leaders recoil from that confrontation and allow Bob to continue counting that offering. So that's how it happens.
Yeah, I think Rich, you know, on a lot of these we're going to see a key concept is having multiple people involved. I think sometimes it's easy to think, you know, it'll streamline the process if we have one person count the offering and do the deposit, and kind of one person is kind of our go-to person. But it's a key concept here to have multiple people involved in the process. Sometimes that takes a little bit longer, and it's a little more challenging to lead multiple people through those steps, but it always makes things safer.
Yeah, it's what CPAs refer to as a division of responsibility. And by dividing responsibility, you greatly ensure and contribute toward an internal control type of environment.
You know, one of the things that I would say is that we should have the people that you have counting should both be unrelated. So number one, they're unrelated.
Not a husband and wife?
Not a husband and wife. But then also rotate weekly, if you can, the counters of monies with different individuals, so you don't have the same person doing it every week. So if you've got enough people in your church where you can do this, so if you have less money coming in all the time during one person counting, you're going to actually probably notice it, and they're going to notice it because of the division of duties.
Yeah, and that's the second point that I would make, having a pool of counters that you randomly rotate. And then the third point is making sure that at least two persons collect the offering. You say, well, how does that happen? Well, in some churches that have balconies, now think about this. You may have an usher up there, one usher sometimes, collecting the offering and bringing those plates or bags down the stairway that's isolated and unsupervised down to the floor, ultimately to a counting room. And that money is unsupervised. It's unaccountable for that period of time. And I know of a number of cases where people have, in fact, embezzled funds under those circumstances. So you want to have two people involved in counting, and not just counting, but carrying offerings to the counting room.
One of the things that a church can also do is actually have church envelopes for their members. And that way, if people, number one, put cash in an envelope, it's not easily accessible to somebody that is in a balcony, number one. Number two, it also makes sure that people get the giving credit for that cash that they give.
Yes, and offering envelopes, let me make an important point here. They are not legally required to substantiate contributions. There's a widespread misconception. We've got to use offering envelopes. or your contributions are not going to be tax deductible. That's nonsense. You don't need to use them, but there are reasons why you would want to. It does greatly reduce the risk of fraud. That's number one. Now let me mention some of the other ones we looked at last week, gentlemen. Offering counts are submitted to the person who deposits the offering. Again, different persons should be counting and depositing the offerings. The next point, number 5 on my list of what we covered last week, the offering counts and bank deposit slips are not regularly reconciled. A sixth weakness would be only one signature needed to write a check. Most of the cases of church embezzlement that I have reviewed, out of dozens, scores of them, most of them come, I would say a lot of them, maybe not most, come down to this one point: sole signatory authority on the church checking account. And I'm not opposed to a church maybe having sole signature authority for one person for checks of up to a certain amount. But I would make that a very low amount. In fact, I'm opposed to it in general.
Right.
I know some churches make it checks above 500 or below 500 don't have to have a second signature. I don't agree with that. So, but having a second signature, to me, it's one of the fundamental postulates of internal control.
One of the things that I'll just follow up on that, have your signature card at the bank also, that if you have a certain amount, like it requires 2 signatures to have any check over $100, that signature card is on at the bank, so the bank does know that requirement is in place.
Yes, and here I might bring up another point, and that is the risk of using digital signatures or signature stamps. Many churches use them, and there have been cases of embezzlement. We talked about one last month where an individual embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from his church. He was a financial volunteer or employee, actually, and he was able to have unrestricted access to digital signatures of all the officers of the church, and he was able to increase the church's line of credit, ultimately leading to misappropriation of funds of close to $1 million. So if you use digital signatures or signature stamps, just be aware that that is a major risk that you encounter. Any comments, gentlemen?
No, go ahead.
Members, yeah, we talked about offering envelopes. Contribution receipts are not issued to members. Most churches, I think, do issue contribution receipts quarterly, semi-annually, sometimes annually. Those are very important, and it's very important for you to encourage church members, donors, to examine those receipts from the church. This is the church's records, and if your records don't correspond to that, if you have records of donations of greater than what the church's receipt is showing, that's a red flag right there of potential misappropriation of church funds. So encourage people to look for discrepancies and to report them to church leadership. Another weakness in internal control is offerings are not deposited immediately. Obviously, offerings should be deposited promptly with the bank.
I would also say have the checks stamped for deposit only once you get them. So have somebody stamp them for deposit only, so they can only go into the church's bank account.
Yes, good. We mentioned that last month. Monthly bank statements are not reviewed by someone having no responsibility for handling cash. That's another weakness in internal control. Obviously, you want to have those statements reviewed by an employee or church officer having no responsibility for handling cash or issuing checks. And then my last one, number 11, was that we mentioned last week, making sure that you do not reimburse employees' expenses without adequate substantiation. This is another major source of financial crimes within churches, is churches or church officers sometimes writing checks to themselves for things that have not been properly accounted for in terms of business purpose. And we mentioned last week the related issue of pastors sometimes thinking that they have been underpaid, and many times they have been because of the economic climate, maybe a downturn in contributions, maybe what the church authorized for salary, the church was unwilling to pay. And so over a number of years, a pastor will just start writing checks to him or herself so that I get what I deserve. Well, that may be what you deserve, but that can be a very serious matter. And this relates again to this issue of making sure that reimbursements from the church are for properly accounted for expenditures that have been authorized by the board.
A couple more things. I would have the counting that we mentioned last time. Counting should be done behind a locked door when they're doing the offerings. And it's great to have a camera overlooking the counting area as long as the people know that there is a camera in the room.
Yeah, there was a case in California, I think we mentioned briefly last time, where a church was actually found liable for having a secret camera in the counting room, where they were looking for the perpetrator of what they perceived to be embezzlement of church funds. And the court said this was likely an invasion of privacy, which is intruding upon the seclusion of an individual in a way that would kind of shock the conscience. And so the point is, let people be aware that just like in a bank lobby, you see the cameras all over the place. And that's just as much a deterrent as trying to hide that camera somewhere where the person can't see it. Because if that's what you're going to do, to try to catch the person, you run the risk of personal liability for the church for invasion of privacy.
You know, Rich, I think the other angle on that too is, we have a camera in our counting room and we use multiple teams. We do a lot of these controls we've talked about with regard to the offering. And sometimes when you first put those things in place, the counters can say, well, what do you not trust me? Well, it's as much of a factor of protecting the counter and the people that are involved as it is protecting the church's funds, because if something were to come up missing, it protects those individuals that are involved to be able to say, clearly it wasn't Bob in the offering room because Bob has some accountability in place and we can verify that Bob is in the clear. Kind of using that example from earlier.
Just like having a video in the nursery. We've talked about this in other presentations. It's just wonderful forensic evidence to explain why a toddler has suspicious bruises. Was that child molestation? Well, if you have a video, you can replay and you can see the child fell off a stool. Then you can completely eliminate the potential of abuse.
Deposit should be made as soon as possible. Place a deposit in a locked bank bag and place it in a safe if you cannot use the night depository that immediately.
Jerry, one other thing we've started doing here as well is we use a check scanning service. We have a scanner in our accounting area, and we deposit those checks immediately upon receipt. And when the check goes through the scanner, it's deposited at the bank immediately in real time, and then our service retains a copy of that check for 2 years. So it kind of removes that whole, transporting the checks to the bank.
Excellent.
And a layer.
Great point.
A layer there. So that's a great tool for people who want to take advantage of it.
One of the others, do not sign checks in advance. Do not sign blank checks. Invoices and check requests should be marked paid with a date and check number and filed so they don't get paid more than one time. Bank reconciliation should be approved by someone not authorized to sign checks or make the deposits and should be done promptly. One of the things that we see is if you're going to do it a year afterwards, people forget about things, and it's hard to look for checks out of sequence and that sort of thing. So if you do see checks out of sequence, you need to take a look at that because somebody may take an older check and do something with that. All disbursements will be made with pre-numbered checks and must be accounted for on a weekly basis. So you know the checks that you're using. The signers of checks must not be the person authorizing the expense. So you have, again, a segregation of duties there. Church financial policy in writing. So you have your segregation of powers in writing right to begin with so everybody knows what's expected of them. And one of the things that we have mentioned is conduct a background check and credit reports on those that are handling the church funds. So how many times have we seen somebody that has a background of doing something before and they do it again because nobody has held them accountable to it? And one thing that we also mentioned that is probably one of the more important things is engage a CPA or an auditor to come in and audit not only your internal controls but your financials so you have a check and balance there, which gives the congregation a good feeling that they know what they give their money for is being used for that purpose.